Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of an ongoing series entitled, Is This Pilot Actually Good? Where what we are doing is going through a number of the biggest pilots from the past several decades, rewatching them, checking them out, getting some opinions together, and then having some fun discussing them. Of course, we want to know from you guys if there are still suggestions you have. Let us know in the comments below. We are doing these videos every Saturday and Wednesday, and today we're getting into Game of Thrones.
It's a big one.
This is, to me, probably one of the most watched pilots of the past 10 years. I remember when it first came on, like, the ratings were big for HBO, but they weren't, like, behemoth level, but it's sort of like more and more people over time sort of told their friends, hey, have you seen this show, Game of Thrones? And a lot of people are watching it. They're getting on board by the time Game of Thrones ended. It had, like, an exponentially bigger audience than it had at the very, very beginning.
Yeah, and we're taking this series just with the pilot. So full disclosure, we have both seen the entire series. I've actually watched the entire series twice, except for the last season. I've only seen it once. But we just want to let you guys know where we do have knowledge of the rest of the show. But the idea of this series is if you just watch the pilot and you didn't hear any of that chatter of, oh, have you seen this show? If you just watch the pilot, would you watch any more?
I wonder why you only watched the final season once. Okay, now I'm not going to get too much. We're not going to talk about the final season.
You secretly have watched it 100 times.
I may have watched it. I may actually be more favorable on the final season of Game of Thrones than most people. But no,
You're on an island.
I will live on my island. But I think in general, the pilot of Game of Thrones, fairly well received. But we'll get into it and actually tell you at the end of this, is this pilot actually good? And before we dive in, if you do like this video, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any other updates.
So what I usually like to start with in this stuff is just sort of the simple, what about the theme song? What about the opening credits? Is this something that catches you right away? Does it make sense for the show if you've only watched the beginning and you've only watched the pilot?
I really like the theme song. I think the theme song is probably top 10 of the last 10 years. I think that the theme music is great. If you have had your theme song, or just even your opening sequence, impersonated or like mocked in some shape or form, and I feel like there are approximately 3,000 YouTube videos of people putting some variation of the Game of Thrones theme song onto other things that they like in pop culture.
No, I agree. Theme song is A+. I think this is a very epic show. It's a fantasy epic, and yes, this fits well. Now, when it comes to sort of the opening credit sequence with all the different maps and all the like sort of steampunk gears and everything that's going on, I'll say that that's kind of middle of the road for me. I've never really loved it. I understand it because now I've seen the whole series, but when you're first watching it and you see all the maps and here's this and here's that and it's sort of this futuristic kind of steampunk with the gears, I'm like, this just doesn't fit the way that I think they kind of missed the mark on it. I get where they were going, but it didn't stick the landing for me.
I like the geography aspect, but I may just be a big geography nerd. So I'm fine with geography. So I like that. I was like, oh, I should pay attention to this place and that place. I'll agree that the gears are a little bit weird because we already have Gears of War. That is a video game. We don't need Gears of War Game of Thrones edition. I know Gears of War isn't just about gears. But anyway, it's just I think they could have done something different to sort of construct the map of giving us a sense of what's going on in the world. But a couple other interesting factoids on just this pilot itself, and I'm sure we will get to this and talking about some other pilots as well through the series. This was actually not the first pilot of Game of Thrones that was shot. This was the second go-around, because sometimes you don't get things right the first time. HBO's got billions upon billions of dollars, and it's a good thing because legend has it the first pilot of Game of Thrones is terrible and would not have worked at all.
Yeah, I've heard the saying that it was quite a stinker and that the creators kind of have a fun sort of little back and forth with Kit Harington where he's kind of, worried that it's going to come out, that he's, it thinks it's embarrassing. Everybody kind of was not, thinks the same as him, sort of thing. So, I mean, it was a pass.
It's
one of the biggest shows. The pilot was a pass.
Yeah, it's also so interesting that there are a couple of actors, most notably Catelyn Stark, Daenerys, played by different actors in the original pilot.
Yep.
Are those actors off somewhere now, sort of just like shaking their fists into the heavens and being like, I could have been on this show for 9 years, but...
Yeah, but the problem is if the pilot stinks and you're part of a pilot that stinks, then you're probably like, yeah, I don't think I want to continue on with this. So I don't blame them based just on that pilot that they were like, and I'm out.
Yeah, not everything just works the first time. Patience, it is a virtue, and it has certainly benefited a number of other shows. Maybe we'll do a Big Bang Theory at some point. I think to me that's the other most notable example of a show that has just like a really terrible unaired pilot that I think that one's actually on YouTube. I don't think there's any way you can check out the original Game of Thrones pilot.
No, it's nowhere right now. That's the threat that they're going to release it, and everyone's going to be like, oh no. So we also need to talk about just the fantasy genre in general, because it is not an easy genre to get people behind. I mean, I'm a huge Vikings fan. I love Last Kingdom, but I'm also a big nerd, and those sort of fantasy, dragons, battles, knights, all that kind of stuff. I love that stuff. So, but trying to bring in other people that are kind of like, oh, dragons and whatever, that's a pass. I found it really interesting that this show was able to do that and to bring in everybody. Cool kids were watching this. Nerdy kids were watching this. Everybody was watching this, which was just incredible to me.
I have a couple theories as to why this is. I think one of them is there's just enough fantasy in the pilot that it feels like fantasy, but it's not completely overrun with it. You have places like Winterfell and King's Landing that normal people can actually pronounce, and you don't have too many like weird, whimsical things for people to kind of get on board with. And the premise is so simple in a way. I love the one-sentence summary that you have to present to network executive man, and he's sitting there at HBO on his own throne of just $100 bills, being like, "All right, give me this. I have a brunch in 10 minutes. I need this thing so I can go and talk about how awesome I am." And this is what you could just say. We even talked about this beforehand, but the show is the title. Like, it is literally a Game of Thrones. It is about strategy, and it is about battling with thrones, the dragons, the White Walkers. It's all kind of secondary to the central battle of the thrones.
Yeah, the main plot of this show is about the political shifting chess game of who's going to end up on the throne, who's going to, who is fighting for that throne, who doesn't even want the throne, and who will end up on the throne. That's really what the show is about. But if you're not willing to really give it a chance and you kind of just look at the title and you hear it's got dragons, it's hard to then jump into the show, because right away you're going to be like, oh, there's dragons. All right, nah, pass. That's why a lot of this show kind of built with the word of mouth to be like, this show isn't actually about dragons and magic and all this other stuff. It is kind of secondary.
So, in terms of everything that worked, we just went over the balance. I think the balance of genre in the pilot, really, really good. Visually, it is a gorgeous pilot. Like, the backdrops are awesome. The cities are awesome. The costuming is really, really great. Jaime Lannister's suit of armor is still one of the coolest suits of armor. I will be your suit of armor guide here at the channel, but I think a lot of it's just a really cool pilot to look at, and they do a good job of differentiating locations and making you feel like, even if you're not fully explaining, here's where Daenerys is, here's where King's Landing is, like geographically it can be a little confusing, but at least they all look different and they look good.
They look very different. You know where you are when you are at each place, and that is important in a show where it could get very overwhelmed with things. So they did a good job with that. The pilot set up a lot of sort of what is going to be going on with this. You learn that there's the White Walkers. They haven't been around for thousands of years. Now people are seeing them again. And it's kind of interesting that that was the very first part of this pilot that you jumped into. Because at that time, The Walking Dead had been on the air already for a year. It was zombie everything at that point. Everyone had zombie shows, zombie movies. It was just zombie everything. So Game of Thrones came out about a year later. Now they've got zombies. Yeah, they're White Walkers, but they're zombies. They're undead. They're back from the dead. It came at a really good time. And I kind of wonder if Game of Thrones had maybe started up 4 years later, if people were kind of like, oh, another zombie show. But they set it up really well. We know that there's this problem with the White Walkers. We know sort of what's going on with, you know, King Baratheon, that him and Ned have a relationship. His head, you know, the Hand of the King is dead, and he's up here asking his friend for a favor. It shows sort of who the main players are, at least when it comes to that.
I think that is really, really well executed. I mean, I would make the case that maybe the intro is maybe a minute or two too long. I think they could have cut some of that out there. I kind of got it that White Walkers were bad a little bit faster than they showed, but I do think they set up very well. Here are some important people. Here's what you need to know. Ned could be the Hand of the King. Doesn't really know if he wants to be the Head of the King, but I think all of that is done really well. I think the casting is great. Like, really across the board. Sean Bean, excellent Ned Stark. You get on board Ned Stark really quickly as a character. You know, he's not necessarily, I think, somebody who we would all make the same decisions as him, but we kind of understand where his head is at. And I think for people who don't know the books coming into this, you probably think that Ned Stark is going to be your lead for years on end. You need him to be awesome from the get-go, and he is.
The casting for this show is incredible. I mean, Peter Dinklage has long been someone I've been a fan of. The first thing I ever saw him in, which I think was actually one of his very first roles, was a movie with Steve Buscemi called Living in Oblivion. He was in it for like 10 minutes. And the first time I saw him, I was like, this guy is incredible. I love him. And then I started watching everything else he ever came out with in Station Agent. So when I found out that he was in Game of Thrones, that was actually the pull that brought me into want to watch it at all. Like, I love fantasy and all that, and then it was like, oh, and Peter Dinklage is in this, and I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm watching this now too.
They do such a good job of sort of making the most out of the few reasonably big names they have. I mean, I was aware of Peter Dinklage before Game of Thrones. He wasn't an A-lister, but he was somebody I at least knew. I at least knew Lena Headey. She doesn't have as much to do in the pilot, but at least she's there. I knew Sean Bean, but then a lot of the people I don't know, they do a really good job of making some of the kids fairly interesting. Yeah. They don't come across immediately as just bratty kids, but they also do a good job of bringing on board some people that I can just genuinely hate from the get-go, and you need these people who you just want to just shove them off the tower, metaphorically here. Daenerys' brother, like, that guy is the worst. I hate him from the very first second I see him. I want him to go away.
There was a really interesting line in this pilot that if you have seen the rest of the show, that you are like, man, they are really on the ball with this. He said to his sister when they were in that scene with the bathtub and all that sort of thing, he said, when they write the history of my reign, they will say that it began today. And that was obviously not talking about him. And I was just, when I rewatched, I was just like, oh man, from the pilot.
Yeah.
They were so brilliant with their writing and where they were going with this, and things that threaded throughout the entire series of how smart this show is.
There are a number of different things where if you've seen the whole show, you watch moments of the pilot, and I think they really do carry that journey through. However, I mean, I think there were probably some points in, like, the middle of the show they certainly could have done some things better, but I think they came back around at the end of it. And so the pilot, I think, reflects a lot of the rest of the series really, really well. Great battles, great moments. I think even somebody like King Robert, I don't like him. I wouldn't want to hang out with him. He's a tool, but I at least know who he is. He's got a very clear point of view. He's a heel, he's a womanizer, he drinks all the time, but it's sort of like, okay, I feel like I know everything I need to know about this guy after just one episode, and that's good.
Yeah, they did a really good job with the main characters that we really needed to get to know. It was nice that not every relationship was just a mirror of another relationship during that time. So we had Robert and we had Cersei, and we saw what their relationship was like, that he would be a womanizer doing things in front of her, in front of the entire court. She's just taking it. Cersei, we know kind of where she goes as someone who ends up being very unlikable, and she wasn't likable in the pilot either, but she was still somebody that was kind of like, okay, now I'm kind of getting why she's acting this way. This is humiliating. She's the queen and she's being completely humiliated in front of the court that way, and she just has to take it. So there's a lot that's weighing on her, but then to see Ned and Caitlyn's relationship as well, and to see that it's a more loving one. She's asking him not to be the hand of the king. Don't leave. That it was nice to see different things.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that I will say that I had an issue with the pilot is that it was a bit cumbersome. There was a lot of characters and a lot of people that didn't necessarily need to be there. And when you're jumping into a pilot and you're trying to start, getting your footing, get to know everybody, when there's this many characters, it's very cumbersome.
There's a lot going on, and especially around the Starks here, because Benjen Stark, you could totally forget this guy is even in the pilot, mostly because Game of Thrones himself kind of forgets about him for most of the run, but he just feels really, really superfluous. I think he wasn't needed. He was just like exposition man. Rickon Stark. Like, I don't even know if we ever needed the character of Rickon Stark, if I'm being totally honest, but...
No, and this is going to be controversial to say, but I'm going to say it anyways, and I say it as someone I just said, that I tuned into this pilot because of Peter Dinklage. I love him. He was not needed in this pilot as much as I loved all the stuff that he was in. I love his dialogue. I love his scene with Jon, like Jon Snow. He's so great. But I feel like he could have been introduced in episode 2. I was having a hard time understanding why, he's the brother of the queen who doesn't like him. Why was he brought to Winterfell at all? He didn't need to go. There was no purpose for him to be there. So there was just a lot of characters that it could have been condensed just a little bit to kind of get people's hands on what is the meat of what is going on that I need to know.
The Tyrion debate is interesting because could you have taken his scenes at Winterfell and just put them in King's Landing in the pilot? Could you have waited to episode 2? Because I think there's not a great story reason why.
I like that. You could have put him at King's Landing because we were at King's Landing with Jaime and Cersei at the beginning.
Okay, yeah, so maybe that would have worked because ultimately...
That would have worked better for me.
Yeah, I just think the thing is HBO, they have a couple of very clear imperatives in the pilot, and I think one of them is, okay, we know that Tyrion is probably going to be our fan favorite character, so we want to find a way to throw him in here, even if he's not actually really needed to push the story forward. And he's not, but they throw him in anyway because I think they feel like they have to.
Oh, I agree. He's a great character. I love Peter Dinklage. He's a great actor. So, yeah, they're going to find a way to put him in there. But when you're setting up a pilot that has so many characters, I think they needed to make the tough decisions. That's it. That's where I go with that. Okay, the other thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was the amount of disrobing in the show. And it's not because, I'm a female and there's too much female disrobing. It isn't even about that. I mean, I've watched the whole show. As I went on with the show, there was so much of it that I just kind of was like, well, that's Game of Thrones, and I just accepted that it was the way that it was. Going back and kind of rewatching the pilot, there were certain scenes that I was like, okay, this makes sense. All right, this makes sense. And then I was kind of like, okay, this just didn't need to be here, and this just didn't need to be here. I'm watching, a 60-minute pilot, and there's like 4 or 5 scenes in it where this is what's happening. it just didn't, some of it didn't feel needed, and some of it did.
All right, let's have this conversation, because it's a difficult, I think, walk that HBO is trying to do here, because I feel like what's going on is they really feel that they have to push to make this show as extreme as possible to get people talking about it. And it's manipulative. Like, let's just sort of call it, at least, I think, what it is to a certain extent for guys out there. I think they felt like they needed to have all these scenes with women in various stages of undress so that they could get people interested in the show. And fundamentally, I think there's a couple of them you can make a case for. You can make a case for the scene with Tyrion where Jaime walks in, because that's where Tyrion is a woman who works there. That is her profession. It makes sense.
Absolutely. That was part of revealing what his character is and where he is in his life at that time.
Yeah, I could.
So that completely made sense.
I could have done without the 4 additional women that Jaime brings in. It's like, okay, guys, we get the point.
Yeah, no, I agree that the scene worked with just him and that one woman. Having all the rest of the women didn't add anything for me. It didn't. It didn't go any further than, like, I already know that this is the way that he is. You've already shown me this. This doesn't make it like, oh, wow, he's really into doing this. Okay,
Yeah, I think the scene with the Dothraki women, I feel like that makes sense, because that's their culture. Yes. That seems to be what's going on there.
Yep.
The scenes with Daenerys, I get where they were trying to send a point across that this is a world where very brutal things happen, including with her own brother. I feel like there are different ways that could present it. Ultimately, looking back at it, I sort of feel like HBO wanted to have a lead of their show in this state right at the start of it so that it would get people talking, and I don't think it's really needed that it is there to the level of which it is there. And that's just where I am with it right now.
So the last thing I wanted to touch on was just the last scene of this show, of this pilot, because I think that the pilot overall was quite good. I really liked a lot of stuff in it, but I think that very last scene with Jaime and Cersei and pushing Bran out the window is that moment that I think made people tune in again. Because when I'm looking at a pilot, and in this series, we're looking at the pilot, is this pilot actually good enough to make you watch episode 2 if nobody was like, oh man, you gotta check out the show, you gotta check out the show. If nobody said that, does this pilot stand on its own? And that last scene of seeing this brother and sister together, seeing what happened to Bran, and sort of that ... what's going to happen next. I was just like, oh yeah, I'm going to tune in. I was going to tune in anyways with Peter Dinklage, but
That was lights out. I think that is a fantastic closing scene on this pilot. I think for whatever issues you may have about some of the little stuff in between, and I don't think it's perfect from start to finish, I think having a scene where you have a guy who's doing some very inappropriate things with his sister, which is already shocking, then proceeding to punt a child off of a tower is such a just like jaw-dropping moment where if you don't know the books, this will bring your jaw onto the ground, because the whole sort of sequence leading up to that is that Bran is sort of this kind of mischievous kid who's running around and doing all this sort of stuff, even though he's getting shown up by Arya at various points in the episode, which, by the way, I love. I think that holds up really, really well.
Really well.
I think that was a lot of fun, but that is the scene that makes me definitively say, yes, the Game of Thrones pilot is actually good. I think it is actually great. I think it does have a couple of flaws. I feel like it does push certain aspects of its mature rating way too far for the sake of getting attention for itself. But I think looking back at it, it is such a huge, iconic pilot that does a great job of setting up the story, bringing in a lot of characters. It's probably one of the most ambitious pilots of all time when you think about just how much money this had to cost.
Yeah, what a massive cast, all the locations, all the costumes. I mean, it was very ambitious. They stuck the landing. This is an excellent pilot.
Would you say they stuck the King's Landing in ensuring that this pilot was off the ground It was successful. Game of Thrones goes on for I'm just gonna talk right through it. Game of Thrones goes on for another multitude of seasons. It goes until 2019. It was a little over a year ago when you were all screaming on Twitter about the end of the show. We still have more Game of Thrones. There is another show in development.
Yep.
I think this is a franchise that will stick with a lot of people, but I think overall, the Game of Thrones pilot is really good. It knows what it is from the get-go. It doesn't have to make, at least after the first terrible pilot. And they sort of kind of are consistent with that for the rest of the show. And I think if you watched the pilot way back when, or even if you watched it now and had no knowledge about what the rest of it is, as long as you're comfortable with the subject matter, I think you would continue to watch.
I agree. It is absolutely a great pilot that once I would watch it, I would watch the next episode.
All right, well, we'll wrap this one up, but I still have a lot of fond memories watching Game of Thrones over time, and This is just something that I will say in general for a lot of shows, just because you don't like an ending to something, I don't think it necessarily takes away from the journey, and I'm not going into the Game of Thrones finale conversation, but
no.
I think it's just that I still can sort of separate my feelings about the pilot from everything else that happens way down the road, but anyway, let us know what you thought about the Game of Thrones pilot, or if you're watching it now, what you think in the comments. And if you do like this video, give us a like, subscribe, and you can support us further by checking the link in the description to the store. And we'll see you here next time.